I'm somebody who can lay claim to having essentially been inside a tornado. June 3rd, 1980 is a date which is burnt into the memories of Grand Island, Nebraska residents. On that day, our town of about 40,000 was hit with a slow-moving supercell complex which produced a number of tornadoes which lingered throughout the night. If you want more details of the event, a simple search of Grand Island tornadoes will produce a number of hits that can go into the news and reporting details around it. Our town made national news. We were declared a national disaster zone, and a number of books and movies have been written or based on these events. I lived in the direct path of one of those tornadoes. I was a few days shy of my 9th birthday, and this is now nearly 40 years later, but I still remember that night vividly. My father was away from our house when the tornado sirens rang out. He had gone to play racquetball and then go out afterwards with his friends for some food, so we had no idea where he was. My mother, sister, and I, along with our dogs, stayed in the basement. We had a radio and were hearing over the radio the reports. People who grow up in this part of the US are familiar with tornadoes. They are a part of life, and tornado warnings are taken seriously. But usually nothing comes of these warnings. We go down to the basement and wait them out, and are rarely ever in the way of a direct path. Most of the time, we simply hear the next day that a barn was lost or a few homes were damaged. But this night was different. It had been a scary-looking storm from the beginning. I vividly remember walking that afternoon with a 6-year-old friend who said, "I think there are going to be tornadoes tonight." The sky just looked eerie, even at 3 in the afternoon. He was right, and hours later we were hiding in the basement. My mother had pulled the couch away from the wall in our basement, and we were huddled behind the couch, tucked between it and the cinder block basement wall, well away from any windows or potential wind tunnels. Normally, we would just sit in the basement and not worry, but she knew this was far more serious than any normal tornado. By the time the tornado hit our house, the electricity grid was already demolished, so we had no lights. Only flashlights and some batteries, and a battery-powered radio to get updates. We started hearing the tornado before it actually hit us. You could hear, even in the basement, some howling and the sounds of boards and debris being flung everywhere. We actually knew before the hit that it was there. Then the impact. It was unbelievable. Imagine standing next to the tracks of a freight train that is going 60 miles per hour. Imagine the sound of that kind of ferocity from a few inches away, so close you could reach out and touch it. That's what it sounded like. But even weirder is that reality, when in the middle of a tornado, that the pressure is rapidly and violently changing. So, on top of this furious sound of screaming freight trains, is the fact that your ears are popping at about 1-second intervals. So there's this deafening howl, and through that howl your ears are just popping. I still shake my head remembering it. Never have I experienced something like that since. From our basement hiding place, we didn't experience any significant winds. Mom had been really smart about how she placed us in the basement, but the noise alone was utterly terrifying. To be above ground and experience that, along with the actual direct force, would have been inconceivable to me. The full-on hit probably lasted much less than a minute, then it moved on. The whole time I sat there, holding onto my dog so she didn't run away. When it was done, it got eerily quiet. Then the night went on, with mixtures of rain and no rain, and us staying downstairs the entire time. After it had passed, I got out from behind the couch and laid down in my beanbag. I remember laying in that beanbag, holding onto my dog with my sister and her beanbag next to me. My mom mostly laid on the couch, but a few times ventured upstairs. I don't think I slept at all that night. If I did, it was for the slightest moments. I remember saying the next day, "This is the first time I stayed up all night." What I didn't appreciate that night, because my mom didn't want to share her terror with us, was that the radio was reporting all of the time about the most severe tornado, a monster which tore down Locust Street, a business district, and destroyed a huge swath of businesses. She knew that after my father's game, he and his friend were headed to a restaurant on Locust Street for a late dinner or snack, and she knew the timing of the tornado to know that he must have been there when it struck, in the middle of that monster. My mom went that whole night quietly certain that my father had died, but not wanting to share this with us. With no electricity and no phones, there was nothing she could do to alleviate any fears. She just had to wait and find out what happened one way or another. My father showed up sometime early morning. He had been at a restaurant when the tornadoes hit, and actually was an out-and-out hero, pulling people into a walk-in refrigeration unit just as the tornado directly hit the restaurant. He even had to tackle a panicked woman who tried to run out. He took her to the ground and forcibly pulled her back into the refrigeration unit right on impact. Our car had been totally destroyed, flipped end over end by the tornado. This had pretty much happened to all of the cars in the parking lot. The people there were all safe, but they had no ways of making it back home. I think he got a ride partway to our house from somebody and walked the rest of the way home. When we got up the next morning and walked outside, it was as if the neighborhood had been bombed. Our house was mostly standing. The authorities tried to condemn it, as the exterior wall of our garage was completely gone. But my father argued the point, and we managed to only have damage consistent with about 50% of the value of the house. Insurance covered nearly all of this. So we got new windows, new siding, new carpeting, a mostly rebuilt garage, and probably a new roof. We were the lucky ones. We spent about 2 to 3 weeks living with friends who had not been impacted, and then moved back in. Our next door neighbors on each side no longer had houses. They were leveled completely. The one house was just gone, leaving nothing standing other than the nearly brand new organ they had. Somehow every wall around it had been swept away by the winds, but the organ sat there, nearly untouched other than a chip in one key and a lot of rain damage. It was surreal. The neighbors on the other side had similar devastation. It was like the entire house had just been swept off its foundation. Looking down our street, this was almost the same story down the entire block. It appeared like the tornado had zigzagged back and forth across the street between houses. If your house was mostly standing, then it was likely that each of your next door neighbors' houses were completely gone, along with the house directly across the street from you. It was almost like a checkerboard of devastation, 50-50 odds that your house was gone, but 100% chance that your house got hit hard. Many of my friends spent the next year or more in several FEMA trailer parks dotted around the city while their homes were rebuilt. It was a very strange reality. These massive trailer parks of hundreds of identical white trailers all lined up in a grid formation. That was life for many from 1980 to 1981. Amazingly, very few people actually died. I chalk this up to the familiarity and respect that people in Tornado Alley have with tornadoes, at least in this part of the country. We take them seriously, and with this hitting in the evening, most people were home to get cover well in advance of the actual strikes. As I recall, every death from the tornado was a head shaking, "What was he thinking?" A few of them driving in cars well after the sirens had been blaring. A guy sucked out from his front room window since he didn't believe the danger was real. People with whom I share my story often marvel at it, but I've got several friends whose similar stories are just as interesting or more than mine. It's a bit weird to grow up with such a shared experience. When you and all of your close friends have lived through something like this, it impacts you, but you somewhat take it for granted. But to now be away from these friends with the shared experience, it's clear that this is really unique. Maybe less than 1 out of 1,000 people has a similar story to this. So many people that I talk to find this story amazing and fascinating, but at high school reunions, rarely does anyone talk up this experience. It's just what it was. This was our shared childhood experience. I was out jogging with my sister-in-law over the summer. The sky was a bit gray and it was incredibly hot, but it didn't look particularly bad. I did think that it was a bit odd that the parking lot near the trail was empty though, as it usually was pretty full. We take a trail through the woods at Lake Elkhorn. The heat was horrible, and the fact that we were jogging through a swamp on raised wooden platforms along Little Patuxent River doesn't help. Finishing our jog out into the middle of the woods, we turn around to walk back, incredibly relieved to feel a sudden cool breeze, soaked with sweat and exhausted. We come into a clearing, and then we see the sky, which is utterly black and boiling. We stare for a moment, look at each other in silent "oh shit" mode, and then run to underneath the nearest shelter, a concrete highway bridge. A few other people stranded by the sudden storm join us. Sure enough, buckets of rain followed by quarter-sized hail starts to drop and the winds pick up. Lightning is hitting the ground every minute or so all around us. I see it hit one mammoth sycamore about 1,000 feet away. We later had to climb over it to get out of the woods. It literally shattered into hundreds of pieces and fell onto the path. The trunk of the tree was about 4 feet in diameter. It had to have been at least 150 years old. The after images from the lightning strike blinded me for a while. I just happened to be looking right at it when the lightning struck. Both the best and worst part was when a confirmed tornado passed right over our heads. Thankfully, it didn't touch down for another couple miles, but it was still powerful. All of a sudden, everything got quiet, and then I saw what was literally a wall of wind coming straight at us. Trees bent over sideways and leaves and dirt came flying right at us, and I only had enough time to turn my face away to keep the dust out of my eyes before it hit. I didn't even have time to brace myself. On the way out of the woods after the storm, we climbed over at least 4 large trees down right across the path and innumerable branches. Both my sister-in-law and I got hideous cases of poison ivy from climbing over all those trees. It was both amazing and beautiful. I didn't panic at all during the storm. It was so awe-inspiring that there was no room to feel fear, even when that wall of wind was flying straight at us. But afterwards, once we had to climb over a few trees that would have killed us if we had been near them, I started to panic. I couldn't help but worry, what if my sister-in-law and I had decided to try and make it back to the car before the storm hit instead of hiding under the bridge? But I would do it again if I had the chance, even with all the poison ivy. While driving from California to Mississippi, we got caught in a huge desert storm somewhere in Arizona, or possibly New Mexico, I can't remember. There was a lot of rain and wind, but it started off normally enough. After about 5 minutes though, it started getting crazy. The dirt and sand was so dry that all of the water coming down was kicking it up more than soaking it. So after a few minutes, both sides of the road were completely hidden by dust going up about 30 feet, and then above us was just rain, with the freeway cutting through it. It looked like Moses parting the sea, except it was a freeway parting a giant dust cloud. So that was kind of neat, but then it got really intense. Every time lightning flashed, you could see into the dust clouds, and there were multiple tornadoes or dust devils on each side of us. Deciding to take shelter, we pulled into a motel that was ahead of us and ran into the lobby along with about 4 other people who had come off the road. Just as we were getting into the lobby, the storm really took off, and we started getting hail too. One guy actually slipped in the parking lot and started bleeding everywhere, and me and my husband had to dash outside to literally drag him into the building. Then us, the guy, the others from the road, and about 6 people from the hotel, including the staff, just huddled in the lobby watching the security camera feed from outside on the desk computer. One by one, the cameras were getting taken out by hail or wind, until eventually it was all just static and dust outside the windows. This was like something from a disaster movie, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. I lived in Moore, Oklahoma. Yes, that Moore, Oklahoma. I was 13, I think, when a twister came uncomfortably close to me. The black clouds of the thunderstorm turned a lovely spring day into total darkness within minutes. The violent rain began pounding in sheets. Wind battered the storm doors. I thought for a minute that someone was knocking. The rain worsened. I looked out the storm window in my bedroom, and it looked as if someone was spraying it with a garden hose. On the television in the living room was famed meteorologist Gary England reporting that the tornado watch was now a tornado warning, meaning that we had gone from conditions being good to create a tornado to, guess what, a tornado is actually staring right at you. Then came his speech. All y'all get to your storm shelters. If you don't got a storm shelter, gather your family into the room central to your house, maybe a bathroom. Get your loved ones into a tub. Y'all be safe out there and God bless. Damn, Gary was good. For a second, I actually believed that he genuinely cared for the safety and well-being of every one of his viewers. And then the horns started. Those damn horns. Every Saturday at noon, they would wail those air raid sirens to make sure they functioned. This was not Saturday at noon, and the sound of the sirens meant something much, much worse. If you can hear the sirens, you're in the possible path of a tornado that has currently touched down and is fucking up the lives of a lot of people. The sound of those air raid sirens still give me a panic attack when I hear them. Mom and Dad get a call from the neighbor saying his storm shelter has more than enough room for all of us, so we are rushed to the mudroom and suited up in our rain boots and slickers. Dad unlocks the storm door and opens it up, but the wind rips it from his grasp and slams it open, nearly shattering it. We are corralled over to our neighbor's backyard where he is waving us to rush into the shelter so he can button it up. I look around at the terrifying storm surrounding us. The wind is ferocious. It was tearing at the leaves in the trees and sending whole branches soaring through the air like they were floating down a stream. The cloud cover above us doesn't look right though. The shapes and patterns are unlike anything I'd seen in a normal thunderstorm. It was as if they were rolling. My observations are interrupted by my mother yanking my arm towards the shelter entrance. It's buried deep underground. The stairs leading down to the underground shelter are menacing and foreboding. I sit on a bench in the shelter, surrounded by a handful of neighbors huddling around a transistor radio tuned into the weather station. Our neighbor is having difficulty closing the storm hatch to the shelter, and water is pouring in. He is cursing, so my dad jumps up to help him force it closed. I remember it being eerie in the concrete underground sarcophagus. You can hear a muted soundtrack of the thunderstorm raging above, though. The wind begins to scream like a tea kettle boiling on a stove. I leaned against the cold concrete walls of the shelter and can feel an ever so faint rumbling, like as if a freight train is passing nearby. Then came an immense crashing sound. The neighbor curses and says it's probably the aluminum shed in his backyard collapsing. Time begins to slow to a crawl, and it feels as if we are in the shelter for days. The smaller children begin to get fussy and cry, and the adults are holding hands and praying. After what had to be hours, an inaudible cracking came over the radio, and the adults prepare to exit the storm shelter to have a look. The neighbor and my dad are both cursing and forcing the storm hatch open, but apparently the neighbor's shed had collapsed and debris were blocking the exit. The hatch is blunt forced open, and we eventually get the okay to exit the shelter, and I exit to a war zone. Every shingle on roofs are sheared off. Most of the trees are either uprooted or snapped in two. Anything that wasn't firmly affixed to the solid foundation is now gone somewhere else. We were 2 miles away from the F5 tornado that touched down. We were extremely lucky. My husband and I were driving home from an out-of-state trip a few years ago, in late March, around the start of tornado season. We stopped in Joplin, Missouri to get dinner before finishing the last few hours of our drive into Oklahoma, and I caught a glimpse of the television. It was a weather forecast showing a pretty nasty storm system a couple of 100 miles away. It looked bad, but it also appeared that it would just miss us if we left right then and stayed on the turnpike. There's a zone between Missouri and Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there's no exits anywhere to get off for gas or anything like that. The storm ahead of us looked pretty bad, and we knew we needed to turn off, but there were literally no exits. Lightning struck the side of the road as we passed by, and that's when I realized we were in trouble. After a little while of staring at a storm wall cloud, my phone started buzzing that there was a tornado warning in our area. I showed my husband, and not 5 seconds later a funnel cloud started forming in front of us, not a mile up the highway. Finally, a fucking exit showed up, and we swerved through it, as this appeared to be a rather large tornado that touched down. Not sure how big, we pulled into the gas station and ran inside with a bunch of strangers. Then the power went out. I called my mom and told her what was happening and that I loved her. I was 100% sure I was about to be in serious pain. At the last second, this big-ass tornado turned away and destroyed a few houses, I believe. I can't remember if anyone ended up dying, although I believe that there were a few casualties. We got back in the car and drove home, and it was one of the scariest moments in my life. I was living in Huntsville, Alabama during the April 27, 2011 tornado outbreak. I remembered that bad weather had been expected that day, but I wasn't really prepared for when the tornado sirens started going off that morning around 6 a.m. I had a bad feeling. They had said the worst was to come later that day. Sirens early, before the daytime heating, gave things a chance to get nasty, which was worrisome. Power went off that afternoon, but we were fortunate enough to be able to watch the radar for where the worst was up until then. Large tornadoes missed us just to the north and south. There were rumors that the nuclear power plant at Browns Ferry, about half an hour away, had been hit by a tornado, flew around after the power went out. That was sort of true. The auxiliary power lines into the station were damaged, and they had to perform an emergency shutdown. Several heavy storms with straight-line winds and lightning came through that day, each time worried it might contain another F5. I didn't sleep well that night, even though the worst had passed. The day afterward, we started learning how bad the damage was, and they were estimating up to a couple of weeks without power in some areas. I ended up staying in a hotel in Atlanta for a few days. I had been planning to go there anyway to escape after finals, just pulled the reservation up a week. Wichita Falls, Texas, in 1979. Me, a 5-year-old, and an 18-month-old baby. We had been under warnings off and on all day, and I had placed the mattress in the hall. At 6 p.m., hell literally broke loose and the sirens sounded. I tossed my baby on the floor and covered her with my body, and laid my boy at my side and hung onto him, pulling the mattress down to cover. I looked out my window at the neighbors on their roof. My ears popped, and I heard explosions from the end of the block. All of the doors violently slammed shut. The neighbors screamed and scurried from their roof. My face was inches from the baseboards, and I watched them rise and fall repeatedly. I heard the loudest train ever. I don't know if I lost consciousness, but I definitely lost time. I rolled over and looked up to see the blackest tail of the cloud. It looked evil. I was no longer in the hall, but my baby was still with me. My boy was gone. I was in a hole surrounded by debris. I couldn't scream, I couldn't speak. I just started throwing debris everywhere, searching for my son. I was panicked and crying and screaming his name, at least I think I did. I ended up finding him underneath the rubble. He had come within inches of being decapitated by the hall door, and he was crying. He was accusatory. "Mommy, I called and called for you, and you wouldn't come." We ended up crawling from what used to be our home into a scene from a sci-fi horror film. The area was completely devastated. No house stood for blocks. Men were pacing the streets with loaded rifles. I was in shock and petrified. If someone crossed my path, I turned to follow, like an automatron. Someone took us to a surviving house across town for safety. Somehow my husband located us that night, and we went to my parents. There were no lights for miles. Nothing but darkness and miles of ambulance lights, as far as I could see. For years after, every time the sirens sounded, I melted to a hysterical puddle on the floor. Luckily, my children don't remember any of it. I was in a tornado that at times reached EF3 intensity. About a mile away from my house, the fairly new fire station was unharmed, except that it was lifted off the foundation and moved a couple of inches. It had to be demolished anyway. My house was in a nice little tree-lined neighborhood on a corner lot. Now, I'm a real weather nerd and was always fascinated with weather. This particular day, though, I was very busy with work. I was working from home and was sitting in my recliner, pounding away at my laptop, and my father was watching some basic cable channel. So, we were totally surprised when my sister called in a panic to check in on us. She said the Weather Channel said a tornado is hitting you currently. I said we were okay, as if it was all well, said a quick goodbye, and quickly flipped on the local news. Sure enough, the meteorologist was showing a zoomed-in map showing our little neighborhood about to be hit. I said to my dad, time to go to the master bathroom, as it was the most central room with no outside walls. So we rushed in there with the dog. My dad sat on the toilet, and I sat on the edge of the tub. We had the door open with the news on the bedroom TV, and I could see out the window. The power went out about a minute after we got in there, and so we were just watching outside. It went from looking like a bright afternoon to looking dark and stormy to a much darker, greenish-hued light outside, like late dusk but with angry green light. The still trees started suddenly being really whipped by the wind, and I just shut the door. The wind was strong for a short time, and it was absolutely roaring. I'd say like a loud, gigantic vacuum cleaner more than a locomotive. We could hear a lot of small debris hitting the windows and roof. Then, the bathroom ceiling exhaust fan was going full speed, even though the power was out. The air was rushing out of the house because of the rapid pressure drop outside. It couldn't have been more than a minute, probably less, but that moment felt a lot longer. Still, we hadn't even had time to get afraid. It was suddenly very quiet. We sat there a minute to be sure, and I was relieved none of my 5 giant trees crashed through the roof. But, based on the sounds, we figured it had come close but mostly missed us. I was expecting some damage. A couple shingles missing, maybe. Maybe some dents in the siding or a tree limb on the cars. So my dad goes to the front door and I go to the back door. We both go out, and I'm pretty sure we both said, "Holy shit, come check this out," at the same time. That was our sentiment, if not exact words. Turns out that many homes in the neighborhood had the siding stripped from one or two sides of the house, large portions of shingles missing. Across the street, a giant tree was down, next door roof and siding damage. Indeed, neighbors on all sides of me had damage. The house behind us had a gas leak. The owner was actually calling out and asking for help with it, so my dad grabbed some tools and went over and got the gas to shut off. The ground was coated in twigs and shredded leaves. Shredded leaves were also stuck to the house. The only damage I had was a twig jammed up under a single shingle, and the flagpole on my front porch was snapped off the base. I learned later that the tornado had had about a 40 to 50-ish mile path and varied in intensity along the track from EF0 to EF3. It tore the roof off a big box home improvement store near the beginning and destroyed a 3-story wooden apartment building near the end of its track. When it hit us, it was at the EF0 to EF1 range, I believe the NWS said later. There were so many trees down, light poles at 45 degrees, other damage, and our town was very lucky overall. But I'll never forget the color of the green light and the bathroom fan going full blast with no power on. The super outbreak of April 3rd to 4th, 1974 remains one of the most outstanding severe convective weather episodes of record in the continental United States. I was almost 14 and we had a small horse farm just to the north and east of Xenia, Ohio. We lived in a brick post-Civil War era farmhouse, white painted board fencing around the house, 8 stalls, 2-story Amish built barn, and divided 20 acres in the back, same board fencing. My mother kept me home that day, and I remembered just wanting to get on my horse and ride, but Mom said she had a funny feeling and wanted me to stick close to home. So I ended up helping her with a few chores, fed the animals, and by the afternoon, I was sitting on a big grassy lawn to the side of the house tossing a ball to my dog. It was oppressively hot and humid and very still. I remember Mom kept coming out onto the back porch and looking off to the west. She was making me nervous, but I didn't say anything, and neither did she. Later, I learned that she didn't want to scare me. As I was sitting there in the grass with my dog, I remembered that this shockingly cold little gust of air kind of swirled around me, lifting the little hairs on my arms with goosebumps. When I looked at my arm, I realized that the light had changed. I looked around and sort of wondered because the light was so clarified and vibrant, sort of a greenish amber in color. The blades of grass and leaves on the trees looked stunningly brilliant. As I was looking at this big maple tree, a sudden cold air swirl hit hard enough that the leaves on one side of the tree all turned up. 2 things happened at that moment. My mom came outside, and to the southwest we both saw a wall of dark greenish-black clouds. Then everything happened at once. She said, "Come with me and put the horses out, quick." So we ran to the barn and turned the horses out. Then she had me gallop my appy to the back gate and open it so they were basically just free. I galloped back to her and released him after removing his halter. Then we ran back to the house. At some point or another, she had opened the outside cellar doors, and I was able to call my dog to me as we ran down the cellar stairs. When I got into the cellar, I realized that she had prepared while I was outside playing. There were pillows, blankets, flashlights, milk jugs full of drinking water, and a cooler with snack food all tucked into the corner. This was kind of amazing to me as we didn't have any tornado warnings, and there were no sirens anywhere around Xenia at the time. But people in my family seemed to have great instincts, so maybe I wasn't as surprised as some would be. I was looking out the high cellar window, through which you could see the outside, up out the old window well. I saw it coming up through the back field. It was almost as wide at the base as it was at the top, and black as coal. It was twisting and hopping, so to speak. By that time, it was so damn loud that we couldn't hear each other even screaming. I knew it was going to hit the barn, and it did. Thankfully, it did one of those hops, so it just removed half of the roof. But by then, my mother and I were kind of wrapped around each other with blankets and pillows surrounding us. Regardless of that, I ended up with splinters of wood in my scalp, face, and upper arms from where the cellar windows sucked out and wood from the barn, along with a bunch of other chewed up pieces and God knows what, came into the cellar. I even had mud and sawdust splinters in my mouth, piercing my tongue. I should have just kept that shut, but I couldn't help but scream until the air got sucked out of my lungs and I couldn't breathe for a while, let alone scream. I couldn't have heard it by then anyway. After a point, my ears felt like there were railroad spikes jammed into them. What was actually breathing was the house. I remember a flash of seeing the ceiling, which would be a kitchen floor kind of bowing upwards, bulging up. As it turned out, the kitchen floor lost most of the tiles, silverware, dishes, etc., but our hand towels were still hanging on the little cupboard door rack. Mom just ended up throwing them away anyway, because of the mud and other unmentionable things we found in the house afterward. We lost all of our windows and part of the roof, part of the 100-year-old barn roof, and some fencing, but we were still alive. We had a trench dug through parts of our fields, and some trees were completely knocked over, and some things, like horse tack and tools, were gone forever, never to be found. So, eventually I went to the hospital. Someone came to check in on us and took us there, and I got plucked, as I will forever refer it to. Ever see a video of a dog getting porcupine quills removed? Not quite that bad, but worse was getting iodine scrubbed to prevent gas pocket infection from where the splinters and abrasions were. I had abrasions on my legs, but I really have no idea how. You see, after a tornado has been down for a while, it has killed animals and people most likely, and the remainders of that and manure and ground up asphalt, and you name it, it's all mixed in. It can generate a pretty hellish infection. But anyway, I didn't feel so bad knowing my mother was getting the same treatment in the next cubby. And the horses ended up being okay, but the chickens weren't. But I still can't walk into a lumberyard or eat with a wooden spoon without feeling like I'm gagging.